rest of the evening, we're going to talk about writing clean PHP. Hello. We're going to use Object Calisthenics, and we're going to identify some code smells in order to refactor our code. So I'm Jordan Hoff. A little bit about me. I am a software engineer here at LinkedIn. I have been here 10 years on Saturday, so not as an engineer the whole time. So my engineering career kind of started here. You can find me on Twitter, Jordan T. Hoff, and then both GitHub and GitLab at jhoff. By the way, just a quick side note, if anybody uses, for those of you that use GitHub, it's great. If you don't know about GitLab, personally, I think it's better. So if you have the need to host some personal repositories and stuff, GitLab is a great place. So the goals of this talk is we're going to improve our code readability. That's the main focus. Doing some of these things will also make our code more maintainable. In theory, it'll make it more reusable. And then for those of you that care about testing, it'll make it better for testing. So, and a quick disclaimer, these are not rules by any means. They are definitely just suggestions. So you can adapt as many of them as you'd like, and to whatever degree you'd like, right? So these aren't hard and fast things. You can do them. There's some of the rules say you have to get it down to 1, get it down to 2. So just the idea here is to just apply these things, and the more you apply them, better. To an extent, though, if you take everything very literally and you follow it to the rule, you'll probably loop back around and end up with bad code again. So there's a balance, there's a give and take. All right, so we're going to start with Object Calisthenics, and specifically we're going to talk a little bit about what it is. So the object part of Object Calisthenics is short for object-oriented programming, right? That's what we're all doing here. The calisthenics, for those of you that don't know, it's a form of exercise. Think body weight kind of stuff. But so the idea here is that you're applying some exercises to your code in order to make it better, right?
In a room of developers, body weight type stuff is all you need to go into for exercise.
Thanks for pushing this, I did those in high school once. So a brief introduction to Object Calisthenics. The original idea was introduced by a guy named Jeff Beck, who wrote a book called ThoughtWorks Anthology. That was back 10 years ago. And they were written originally for Java, and then they were adapted to PHP by a guy named Rafael Dohms, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce the other guy's name, about 4 years later. And that was given in a presentation called Your Code Sucks, Let's Fix It. I'll share all of these slides, so all of these links you'll have access to. That one in particular, it's 60 some slides, but if you click through it, it's pretty useful. And then those of you that use Laracasts, just out of curiosity, how many people use Laracasts here? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Highly recommended, especially for brand new people.
He has a series called Simple Rules for Simpler Code. He made it about 4 years ago, but it's still valid today. It only covers probably 4 or 5 of these, some of the things that we're going to talk about today. But Jeffrey explains stuff better than I can. So, all right. So the rules. There are 9 rules. I'll give you a minute to take a look over them. We're only going to focus on 4 of them. But 1 indentation per line, not using the else keyword, wrapping primitive types and strings, using first-class collections, only using 1 object operator per line, don't abbreviate, keep your classes small, no classes with more than 2 instance variables or properties, and then not using getters and setters. And so you can, like I said, there's lots of documentation out. If you want to continue this, we're only going to cover 4 of them, which are kind of the easy ones, the ones that are that you'll be able to go home and remember and actually apply. But if you want to continue that, there's lots of documentation online. So the four we're going to talk about are only one level of indentation, not using else, only using one object operator per line, and then not abbreviating. So we're going to start with the last one first. Don't abbreviate, but also don't be too verbose. So we've all been used to using variable names that are super short, right? And I think this probably stems from maybe computer science courses in college, or most online learning. You have little examples, and they just use X and foo and bar and all over the place. And I think people start to think, oh, I should just use foo all over the place. Use X for some reason, and it's generally a bad idea, right? So for you, maybe if you're going to be the only person looking at your code, that might be okay. But if other people are going to have to look at your code later, they're not going to know what X means. They're not going to be able to keep track of all that, right? It just doesn't make it readable. So IDX, use index, CNT, use count, etc. It applies to method names as well. So instead of DT, which is, sure, it's nice and small to type, but greater than is a little more explicit. And there's an argument against this that back in the day, it used to be, you used to have to actually care about brevity in your code, and it made a difference in compile time and things like that. These days, it doesn't matter. They don't care how long your method names are, how long your class names are, etc. But you can take it too far, right? So you don't have to be overly verbose. Just make it something concise that is understandable for the next person. And then there are some exceptions to that. You can use shortened words if they're words that you would normally speak, right? So we don't say use the database identifier. We say use the database ID, right? We say info, not information. We say URL, not uniform resource locator, right? So just use the words like you normally would. And if they're common abbreviations, that's fine.
UTC for et cetera.
Et cetera. Right? And then the other, I guess the last argument to not doing this is that it takes a lot more typing to be more verbose. But most editors these days that are worth their salt, you start typing REQ and it'll autocomplete for you with a tab. So all of that's kind of thrown out the window. So there's really not a good reason not to do it. Okay, so rule number 2, only use one arrow per line. So this and the original part is, or in the original list is object, or where they, object operator is what they refer to. In PHP, that's the arrow, right? So it connects two different methods together. So you'll see a lot of this, especially in Laravel. Laravel's a big proponent of using fluid interfaces and doing a lot of this method chaining kind of thing. You get a lot of those in a line, 150 characters. You're off in the weeds and it's all kind of crunched together in your editor. Just let it breathe a little bit. You can do white space in between, and it makes for much more readable code, right? And just the idea of using white space in general is I think undervalued. If you're diving into some code and all of a sudden you hit a block like a giant method and it's got not a single white space in it, just bam, 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 bam. Like it's kind of hard to follow, right? So just space your stuff out, give it a little room, and it'll be easier for the next guy to follow. Another example here is this is an eloquent query, and this is pretty typical of what we would do here. So in the top one, you kind of just have to read along to figure out what the heck's going on, right? But in the other example, we kind of break it out, and it's important to note that it's intentional that the first line has 2 arrows in it, because in this case, we're doing a query on the deployments object. So we're through projects, we're getting deployments. So we're kind of leaving those on one line and then doing the rest of them. And it just feels a little nicer than it would be to put that deployments on the next line. So like I said, these are just suggestions. You don't have to follow them to a T. You can just kind of use them as you see fit. Hopefully that feels a little better. So number 3 is only using one level of indentation per line. So this is a very common thing that you'll see. So in this example, we have the run commands method, and right off the bat, it has a conditional. and all of the meat of the code is in that condition, right? And so the only time anything's going to be run is if that conditional is true. And so to break down what the levels are, so right at the root of the method is our kind of 0 level, our base. Within the conditional, we're at the first level, and then within the for each, now we're at a second level. So the idea is to refactor that code to get it down to just one level. And so in this particular case, the easy way to solve for that is to flip the conditional and return early, right? So that would look like this. So now instead of saying if this is enabled, we say if it's not enabled, then go be done, and then all the rest of the meat kind of stays back at that root level, right? So this helps prevent you from getting into the big Christmas trees of death, right? So you for each, if, right? So and you're just drilling down and it starts looking like a Christmas tree after a while. You can kind of back yourself out of that by doing some of this stuff. Yeah.
Could you just go back and see what it looked like before?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So,
that, I guess,
so instead of if, it's okay.
Yep. So it's if for each and then the thing. And so now we're not if, return, and then we do our for each. Other common ways to get out of this is to use other methods, so like single-use methods. So you have a for each and then a block of code. Take that block of code, throw it in a new method, and then call that method from the for each. Right? So you can break that down, and the side effect of that is not only are you pushing all this code back over to that top level, but by using single-use methods, now it's more readable because now you have a descriptive method that says, okay, this is now what we're doing in the code. And then you can go to that method and see what's happening, right? And so it kind of works as like an inline documentation. Okay, so the fourth rule for object calisthenics that we're going to talk about is not using the else operator. And this is a big one for us here at LinkedIn, or within our team, I should say. And it's probably the one that we get the most weird looks about, right? So else is like you learn else on your first day, right? If and then else. But it's kind of a bad word around here. So the idea is that usually if you're using if statements or if you're using else statements, then you're usually kind of building something up to then return it at the end. And so the way to get out of that is to use early return. So in this particular case, I'll go back real quick. So we're saying if it's not deployed, then set the status to undeployed. If the deployment status is active, then set it to running. Otherwise, set it to whatever the current status is, right? So you're just building up this variable, and then at the end we say return status, right? Return whatever you've done. So if you're imagining coming in here, trying to troubleshoot something, right? You have to read through this whole thing and get all the way down to the return before you know what's happening. If we instead do early returns, then we can break this up and it becomes a lot easier to look at, right? So our first section is if it's not deployed, then just return undeployed, right? We're done at that point. There's no reason to continue. Otherwise, and basically the rest of the method becomes your else without having to write it. So our else if, I guess, has now become the second block. So if the deployment status is active, then just return running. And then if all else fails, then just return our status. So it gets rid of that temporary variable. It's another thing that we don't have to think about. This is a lot easier to grok if the next guy behind you is code diving, right? He's trying to figure out why something's wrong. He comes in here and he's like, oh, well, okay, it's deployed, so it's not that one. The status is active, so that's why it's returning running, right? It's really easy for him to figure that out. He doesn't have to hit the bottom of the method in order to figure out what's going on. And I guess, in my opinion, I feel like this is a lot easier than this is. It's just a lot less going on. It gives you room to kind of space things out.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What if we're not returning the variable and we will do something with it afterwards, and
Sure.
we can get to like second condition after the first one?
Right. So yeah, and it's you're not always eliminating a variable, but oftentimes using a separate method or something to take a chunk out will still give you that same effect, right? So you have, if we go back to this case here, maybe status equals some method instead of the string undeployed, right? Or if this code prior to this had some nested stuff in here, just kind of breaking all of that out so that we don't have.
I mean, without else, we can probably go to the second condition. Sure. After we went to the first one.
Right. Yeah. So I guess the idea with if you're not returning early, you can always get out of using an else by using other methods. So this is kind of an incomplete example, but you can say, if some conditional, then return and then call a method that then goes and does the rest of your stuff, right? So it kind of forces your hand on early returning, but it also forces your hand on breaking your code up into different methods. And it's not always avoidable. Again, going back to these aren't hard and fast rules. If you got to use an else somewhere, use the else, right? But it's a good exercise to go through if you're writing an else, to step back and say, do I really need to do this, or is there a better way that I can get around?
I will note that we have, in 2 years, working on our Laravel projects internally and having to follow this rule because our build tools enforce it. I've never not been able to eliminate that.
And
whatever that's worth.
And to continue that thought, it's never felt like we're making the wrong decision by skipping the else.
That's what I was about to ask you.
Right.
So it always
plot twist. They don't write code ever.
And I wish I could describe to you more elegantly why that's the case, but yeah, I mean, I don't think we've ever been in a situation where
so if you have to reuse this variable later in this method, you just put it into different methods, right?
Right, exactly.
And you can still create a variable if you really need to.
Right.
If that's what your use case is, you have to have one, just put it in there. The variable isn't the bad thing. The else on its own isn't the bad thing.
Right.
It's just that using the else's leads to code that could be better. And I would say the end result is that our code ends up being better for having followed this.
Kind of like the UPS driver, they just make right-hand turns.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So that was the Object Calisthenics that we're going to cover here today. So those are the 4 there. Some of the other ones, key classes small, that's pretty self-explanatory. No classes with more than 2 instance variables, kind of it's the 2 is a little aggressive. And I think it's more of a Java thing. In PHP, I think it's a little more reasonable for that number to be around 5. But again, it kind of goes back to the keeping classes small thing. It's kind of a guideline to help your classes stay small. No getters and setters, that's a little extreme. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that one. And the wrapping primitives is probably a good thing. So that's like if you have a money, like if you're dealing with money, you make a money class and all the functionality that's related to that. First class collections kind of applies, but not really. So anyways, so those are Object Calisthenics. I highly recommend just going out and reading a couple of different, even if you just Google it, a couple different resources. Take a 10-minute read and you'll get it, right? And if you try and apply these, then it'll help pretty tremendously. So the other half of the talk here is we're going to talk about code smells. And who here knows the term code smell? Has heard it before? Yeah. Okay. So code smells. So like we broke down the last one, the Object Calisthenics. We're going to break down code smells. So code refers to your
This is
code.
the best slide of the
In case that wasn't obvious. The smells refers to things that are bad, but not necessarily, right? So the idea here is that smells aren't always bad, but too many of them can be bad, right? So we definitely want to do what we can to get rid of the smells. as best we can, but it's not the end of the world if we don't get rid of all of them. So a little bit of information about this. So code smells were originally kind of introduced by a guy named Beck in the late 90s. And then Martin Fowler, who wrote this book here, which if anyone has it, it's, I'm going to be honest, I have not read the whole thing. It is, from what I understand, a very difficult read. And I'm not a big reader, but it's just, I've been using it for the preparation of this, and I've used it a little bit before that. It's a great reference book. And the idea is that it's so right in the first page here, every one of these things that you see here, I don't know, 60 maybe items here. These are all different ways, different approaches to refactoring. So, moving methods or moving code or, doing different types of techniques in order to make your code better. So that's the bulk of the book. On the third chapter of the book is literally bad smells in code. So this is where the list comes from. This is maybe, I don't know, 8 to 10 pages maybe. And it breaks down what each one of these are, little 3 or 4 paragraphs of each. So if you can get your hands on this book, if anything, take 10, 15, 20 minutes and read this chapter 3, and you'll be in a good place. Additionally, if anyone went to Laracon last year or watched the videos, Sandi Metz is a Ruby developer, former Ruby developer, and she did a talk about most of the code smells, and she kind of breaks them down into different groups and all that kind of stuff. So that speaker deck thing, and there's a couple videos on YouTube, well worth the watch. They're only about 30 or 40 minutes, but kind of a neat talk. And I'm, just to be completely transparent, I'm stealing a little bit of her content for this. So this is not all new stuff.
She'd probably be flattered.
Yeah. Or I'm going to get a cease and desist.
One or the other.
Not making any money. All right, so these are the different code smells that are identified. Again, these are all from this book here, but it's kind of a generally the de facto standard of the different types of code smells. So there's 22 different ones. And like I said, Sandi divides them up. I think someone else did it, but she refers to it in her talk, that they're all divided up into kind of 5 different groups in how they affect your code in different ways. 2 of those groups are bloaters and dispensables, and those are what we're going to focus on primarily today, mostly because, again, they're the easy ones that you're going to be able to walk home and remember today. So the ones that we're going to actually look at, duplicated code, long method, large class, data clumps, lazy class, speculative, generality, data class, and comment. So the rest of them, they have some really fun names. So shotgun surgery, that's kind of cool.
It looks like a lot of good band names in there.
Yeah.
Inappropriate.
Divergent change, yeah. So yeah, they're some of them are really advanced, some of them are really niche, like stuff that you may never ever run into. But
Inappropriate.
yes, that yes. Don't touch other people's private. That's the idea there. Yeah, we're gonna pick off the easy ones here. All right, so to start off, we're gonna talk about duplicated code. So hopefully everyone already kind of does this, right? So don't copy and paste the same thing over and over and over again. Leads to a nightmare in maintainability, and it's just generally a bad idea. Hopefully, if anyone's done any online training or taken any college classes, they didn't teach you to do this, right? So, but pretty straightforward. If you have the exact same code within a class, break that off, make a method, call that method from each location, right? If you have the exact same code in 2 classes that extend the same parent, again, make a method, put it in the parent, call it from there. Now in Laravel, it's fairly frequent that you have shared code so like in an Eloquent model, for example, you have a couple different models, but their parent class is in the library, right? And you can't actually add a method to the library. So a good alternative to that, if your parent is outside of your control, is to use a trait. Does everyone know what traits are? Is anyone, the basic idea of a trait is it's kind of like copy and paste code, but it does it for you at runtime. So that's a good alternative for that. Again, so applying, if it's not exact code, if it's similar code, use some parameters to kind of note the difference and make that method work for you. One important note on making a method with parameters, if you find yourself doing Boolean parameters, so you say, you know, I think of a good example, but
make request headers equal.
Right. So basically a Boolean parameter in a method is a good indicator that you're going to say, well, if that, then do this, otherwise do this, which is a bad idea. The better idea is to just make two methods. This method does that one thing, this method does that other thing.
Make request and make request with headers.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you have duplicate code in completely different classes, then that's what kind of traits are originally intended for. And then has everyone heard of the rule of three? Anyone not familiar with it? So the rule of three is basically that it's okay to copy something once, but as soon as you copy it a second time, that's when you need to you know, refactor and get those get that duplication out. And it just comes down to balance. Like, you know, you don't want to like go super hard and not ever copy a single method or a single line of code twice. Like, it's okay if it happens once or twice, but if you're doing it over and over, that's a good indication that you need to step back. So, all right. So number 2 is long methods. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. You got a method in a class and it's got 400 lines. Refactor that thing, right? And so break it down into different shorter methods. And one big argument against this is that single-use methods are not a good thing. And I would definitely argue against that. It doesn't matter if a method only gets used by one other method. You know, you're kind of creating this like chain. But what it ends up doing is it kind of self-documents your code, right? So if you got a big chunk of code that's complex inside of another method, break that out, make it its own method, and then just call it from within the first. There's no performance benefit for lumping all your code in one method. PHP doesn't care if it's all in one or if it's in 40 different methods, it's going to run just as fast. So the parser takes care of all of that. So at the end of the day, it benefits the developer to break all of that kind of stuff up. And going back to the editor, any editor should be able to drill down really quickly into these different the method chains in order to give the next guy an idea of what's going on, right? Yeah, so it should in theory make it more readable the shorter the method you have. Number 3 is somewhat related to methods, but large classes, otherwise known as God classes. So giving a class too much responsibility, making it do lots of different things is generally a bad idea, right? You're going to have a lot of code bloat. You're going to have too many methods. A good indicator of a God class or large class is too large is that you have a lot of properties within it, and or that you have a lot of public methods. So if the kind of API to interact with that class is like, you know, I got these 72 methods that you can call on my class. That's a pretty good kind of, you know, indicator that your class is way too big. So one in particular that comes to mind is Eloquent in Laravel, and it's worth pointing out that Eloquent is kind of neat, and I actually maybe want to do a talk on this later. That in that Eloquent, the main model class actually delegates to 2 other classes for a lot of its functionality. So from the front end, you have your documentation in it. You know, it says, yeah, there's 40 some methods on it or whatever, but really there's like 20 for the model, and then there's like 15 or 20 for the query builder, and then there's, so it kind of delegates automatically. There's some magic that happens there. So having a lot of protected and private methods is okay, right? So that goes back to those single use methods. If you're breaking a lot of those down, but it's only visible to that class, it's fine, right? So really the indicator is how that class looks to the outside. All right. So number 4 is data clumps. So a data clump is basically a group of variables that is often passed around.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Talk about chunk names. Wonderful.
Chunk names? Oh, I skipped that. I'm sorry. So the refactoring opportunity. So if you have a gigantic class and you have a bunch of methods that are all prefixed with the same thing, right? Or they have the similar suffix or properties that are all kind of like, that's a pretty good indicator that you could break all of that stuff out into a separate method, right? You can make a class. I mean, so you can break that all out and kind of make it its own thing, and then have the constructor in your main class new up an instance of that and then interact with it directly. So, yes, thank you. Okay, data clumps. Data clumps are groups of variables that you'll find that often get passed around together. So we'll just jump right to the example here. An example might be start date and end date, right? You have start date and end date, and it's showing up in a bunch of different methods, and you're kind of passing it around. Instead, you might make a date range class that when you instantiate it, takes those two, and then you just pass that date range around. And so the benefit is that it'll simplify your parameter list. So now instead of having 2 things in your parameter list, you'll have 1. You can maybe make it a property in the class that you're using, and then you don't have to pass it around at all, etc. So a person might be another example, right? So that's kind of the idea of data clumps, and just kind of knowing how to identify those data clumps and then applying this will surprisingly make a huge difference in how simple your code gets. So it seems like a really small thing, but it really does make a big difference. Okay. Number 5 is my favorite one, speculative generality. It's a very aggressive name, but the idea is that this is when you write code that nobody asked for. So who's done that before? Right? You're working on a project and you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure that we're gonna have to do that someday, so I'm just gonna write a class for it, or I'm gonna build the models up for it, or don't do it. It's a gigantic waste of time, right? You're not doing what your client or what the project is asked of you, and 9 times out of 10, if you ever get the chance to use that code later on down the line, you're not going to have gotten it right. You're going to have to go back and refactor it. And what ends up happening is that this code that is not being used is still sitting there. And so as you work around it, you got to work around it. You got to kind of, avoid it, or, make concessions for it or whatever. And then, it ends up making your code a lot more. So, and I will be the first to admit that I do this constantly when I'm coding. In fact, it's almost always the first thing I do when I start a project is I have my database schema, and then I go and I make relationships for every possible, thing. And 9 times out of 10, most of those relationships never get used, right? So you write the relationship when you need it, not preemptively. Is the idea. Okay, so I think the rest were pretty quick. Number 6 is a lazy class. So this is similar to the last one, speculative generality, but with little to no effort. So stubbing out a class that you think you might use later, but not actually writing any methods in it, don't do that. Don't write the class in the first place. Another way that these can happen is that you might go through a refactor and then end up with this manager class that no longer has any functionality in it. Just get rid of it, right? So if it's not worth having there, then find a way to eliminate it.
Has anybody ever walked into the code base and there's 10 models in the app directory and they're all // Like, nothing names. Why are these? Drives me crazy.
Okay, so number 7 is a data class. It's very similar to a lazy class. And the idea is that you created a new object, and it has a couple properties, and the only thing is that you can set those properties and get those properties, and it does nothing else, right? So it's just basically an object container for a couple of variables, and there's actually, this is kind of like the other end of the data clump, right? So when we take a couple, the start date and the end date, we make a date range out of it, right? So the idea is that the date range would have some other methods in it that would help you interact with that range, right? If all they were was just a container for start date and end date, then don't do it, because it's not worth it. That makes that you're now generating a data class which provides little to no. So you need to have something that goes in your little helper class to make it worthwhile. Okay, and the last one is comments. And it's worth noting that comments are not necessarily a bad thing. They're not a code smell unto themselves. They definitely should be used as much as possible. But the idea here is that comments can be used in order to hide other code smells. So if you have an inline comment right in the middle of your method, and it explains the next line below it, then that's a pretty good idea, or a pretty good indicator that the next line is written very poorly. So just take the time to refactor that line, make it a method with a descriptive name or whatever you need to do to just eliminate that inline comment altogether. And the quote that they use in the book is that comments are often used as deodorant, right? So
I've heard, I like that comments should be why you're doing something, not what it's doing.
Yeah.
That the code should be readable so you can tell what the code's doing in the comments. If it's a weird case and you need to know why you're doing this thing.
That was the first instance that
Yeah.
came to my mind. I'm like, well, I've seen a lot of code that does that, but it is mostly why.
right.
And there are business reasons why that are not
I
scrutable
was
to
going
them.
to say, it's usually like you're documenting some business
Right.
edge case that
Right.
you have to account for.
Like,
You're
why
like,
do we have
well,
to do this?
Sally from accounting always does this wrong, so that's why I had to write this. Whatever, dude.
Yeah, so that's those are the code smells that we're going to cover. Again, if you get your hands on a copy of this, it's not very expensive from Amazon. And after reading it, quite a bit of it for this talk, I think I'm going to start diving into this. So it's not as painful as you might imagine a several 100-page coding book to be. But it is worth noting that it is Java based, so if you're not familiar with Java, it might take some getting used to. So, but yeah, some good content in there. So, okay, we've got these lists of things, and now it's up to us, right, to enforce those, right? So you guys could go back tonight and start writing 1,000-line methods, and nobody's going to care, right? So there are some tools out there that can help you. So notably, PHP Code Sniffer is really useful. If anyone adheres to like PSR 4 or 2, PSR 2 is the kind of style guide where to do your brackets and all those kind of things. PHP Code Sniffer is good at that. It does some other stuff as well that it applies to some of the stuff that we did here today. Mess Detector does a lot of the Object Calisthenics stuff and then some, so it'll actually do static analysis on your code and say, this method is too big, the complexity of this method is too big, the class has too many public methods or too many, whatever. It'll tell you if you have a parameter that you're not using in your method, to just help you kind of clean up your code. And then Sebastian Bergman is the guy that made PHP Unit. He also made this copy paste detector, so you can run this on your code to go check and see if there's any places where there's similar code that might point to a refactoring opportunity. So